Welcome back to the Generation Varied podcast, everybody. This is the podcast where we talk about what is going on in the world with geopolitics, pop culture, movies, sports, all of that kind of stuff, and lots of topics in between. I'm your host, Caleb Norris, and I am joined by my two co-hosts, Ben Okenge and Jack Widener. But today we actually have a special episode for you guys where we are also joined by a very special guest, who's going to talk to us about sort of what's going on with racing as a sport in America. So today's guest is more than just a sports analyst. She's also somebody that I have a very genuine and deep love and admiration for. We'll also get more into the story of how we met and all of that kind of stuff here in just a little bit. But this is is one of the podcast hosts for Racing America, and is the manager for Travis Braden Racing. Over the last several years, this person has also battled and beaten breast cancer at an extremely young age. This person is one of the first people who ever taught me what it meant to be your authentic self, to show up as yourself in places and around people that might not value you or think that you're too much. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to a very good friend of mine, Jess Ballard. Jess, how are you today?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm great after that introduction. I'm going to have to live up to all of that, but I am so excited and grateful you guys picked me as your first guest. Thank you.
Jess, yeah, welcome. We're grateful you're able to join us today. Before I start asking more questions about who you are and just your background in racing and sports, I kind of one of my favorite questions when I meet a friend of a friend is asking how do you guys meet? So how did you meet Caleb? Because I feel like there's always two sides to the story. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I would be interested to hear how Caleb would answer that question. So I'll tell you how I think it went.
Okay.
One day, this would be freshman year of high school. I don't even think it was the first day. I think he came in partway through the school year, but he was a new student. And he walked into the classroom, and we grew up in a very small rural town. We had less than 100 people in our graduating class. This guy walks in, and there is no one else in the school like him. He was just so immediately, he just has this energy. I'm drawn to him, and we just became great friends. And actually, I was thinking about it before the show. Caleb and I never really even had much extracurricular activities together. We didn't play the same sports. We didn't do the same things after school. He actually lived pretty far away. Our friendship genuinely was from just sitting next to each other in class. And then we did go on to take a lot of film production classes together, which is why I think, Caleb, this is so awesome that you got this podcast, because you have always wanted to be a talk show host. And I always thought that you would have been so great at something like this. So anyway, we met through high school. And like Caleb said, I think we really bonded by being a little bit different. Honestly, we probably bonded by being bullied a lot.
Yeah, I was gonna say we bonded over being bullied for no reason. When I tell you, especially I get why I was bullied, because I was super gay and feminine and black and a super straight white conservative space.
No, we were out in Cowtown, country, cornfields. Yeah.
But it makes sense as to why I would get bullied. When I tell you, Jess would catch strays from the most random she'd walk into school with a new pair of boots on, and she'd be like, I just love my boots. And 10 girls at lunch would tweet I don't know who this girl thinks she is with these stupid freaking boots on, but they're ugly and she's ugly. And and I remember watching it happen in real time and just thinking what is going on? Why are people so mean? So we definitely bonded over being bullied, and I mean so many other things. So my recollection of how we met was in Spanish class freshman year, and we ended up, I think, taking all of our Spanish classes together, and neither of us were good at Spanish.
That was another traumatic thing that we endured together.
Neither of us were good at Spanish, and I think we went all the way up to like Spanish 4. And I remember, I think you dropped out like week 2 of Spanish 4, like, Caleb, this isn't for me. And you were like, you need to drop out too. And I was like, no, I can do it. I dropped out.
No, well, listen, we got bullied by our Spanish teacher. I don't think she's going to watch this. We got bullied by our Spanish teacher the first 3 years, and then 4th year with I couldn't do it. I was at my limit, so.
Listen, she's dropping names. We have a reputation already on this podcast, and you are just strengthening that. So you're fitting right in.
Jeff said, name them. We did, like, looking back on it, though, it's the craziest thing to think about, like, all of the, even interactions that we had, like, with other people's parents that would just, like, go sideways on us randomly, like, looking back on that, it's like, what was in the water in this place that so many people beefed with, like, kids?
No, that was literally, like, I remember in the moment being like, I don't understand this situation, but surely when I grow up one day, I will understand all of this. I'm just inexperienced at life. Now that I'm an adult, it was like, it was crazy. It was crazy. And like, yeah, truly, Caleb and I became the closest when we would spend lunch period together, like eating in a closet because we didn't want to eat in the cafeteria. So, there's no better there's no better bond than a trauma bond. So
yeah,
that's why we're such great friends today.
Wow. That is a great story. Yeah, trauma bond is unlike anything else. I'm glad you both had each other at the small town.
Yeah,
because it sounds like
we were just too big for that small town.
Absolutely.
That's what it was.
Absolutely. And I feel like we would be remiss. We're going to bring it up at the end when we do our shout outs, but this is such a full circle moment because this is what we loved doing in high school, was like doing stuff like this. And so shout out to Miss Kersey.
I saw you shared the first episode and she commented on it on Facebook, right?
She did, yeah.
She's so proud of you.
Yeah. Shout out Miss Kersey. She told us one day that life was going to get better and that we were going to find people that valued us, and she was absolutely right. So thank you so much for inspiring us and for really starting this drive that we have to be in media today. Both Jess and I are podcast hosts, so thank you so much for your investment in us.
Wow. Caleb, Jess, thanks for sharing that. I love that question. Listeners, if you have a chance to ask this question to your friends, definitely. I mean, you just heard it live on this, like what can come out of this. But Jess, I want to know a little bit more about you. Maybe Caleb, share with us that you are in racing industry. That is such a niche, like unique industry. I feel like I went through college all 4 years not meeting one person, and to now meet someone like, that's in this industry. Like, how did you get into it? What are you passionate about the racing in America specifically, because it is so unique?
Okay, so I will try to make this I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of how I even got into this, because being from Ohio, NASCAR specifically is very big in the South, like in the Carolinas, but it's not really a thing up in Ohio. It used to be in its heyday, but those days are long gone. Caleb, you'll remember I started working at Flyers Pizza, which was a local pizza shop in high school. Okay, this is crazy. So I'm working at this pizza shop. I had a crush on one of the delivery drivers, and he comes up to me after work one night, and he's a little older than me, like not quite 10 years. He's like, you should come to one of my races. And I was like, he was a little chunky. I was like, I don't think you run races. And he's like, no, I race cars. And I was like, oh, interesting.
You said, I don't think you run races, baby. I'm sorry. I don't believe it for a moment. I'm not coming to damn competitions. I'm coming to watch you lose.
So he's like, you should come to one of my races. And I was like, that sounds stupid, but I got nothing to do this Saturday. I lived in Columbus my whole life, near Columbus. I didn't know we had a racetrack. So I go. When I tell you, I was like, I found purpose for living. This was the coolest thing I've ever seen. And it was because he raced what are called compacts. And it's, compact cars like you can literally go get at the junkyard. His race car was a Chevy Cavalier, but you got Dodge Neons, you got, all the, compact cars. And you just go get one from the junkyard and you basically gut them, put a roll cage in, put a racing seat in, and you go race them. So I'm in the pits of this racetrack that I didn't even know existed. And there's like 30 different teams of like wild rednecks that are building these race cars in their backyard. They all got the team t-shirts. They're all wrenching on the cars and they all got beef with each other. He's standing there telling me like, Dirty Jimmy, don't like him. Big Dog, he's sleeping with Big Ange. And like, it was like this crazy thing. And I was like, the community, it just like, you mean to tell me these people get off work and then they go in their backyard and build these race cars and then they come here every Saturday and race and they beef and they got matching t-shirts? This is the coolest thing I've ever heard. So I go back race after race after race. And I actually think the first race I went to, Rowdy was his name, because of course. And I think he won. And so I was just hooked. Well, then I realized that I could take this a little further. Then I learned about NASCAR and I learned about the glitz and the glamour of like the bigger series and like the real race cars and the races that pay big money. And admittedly, I was like, sorry, dude, I got to move my way up the ladder here. And he actually took me to a lot of races. We would travel, and he had this driver that was kind of from our neck of the woods that he really liked, named Travis Braden. And so I started to follow Travis Braden, and I became a big Travis Braden fan. We had a lot of his hero cards and merchandise. And then one day, Rowdy really made me mad. So I went to a race by myself, and I stood in line to get an autograph from Travis. And I told him how much I liked him, and he slid into my DMs. And he was like, what's good? And I was like, well, I really want a job in racing because that way people would take me seriously, because it was a sport that was kind of hard to get into if you like didn't have roots in it or like a bloodline. And he's like, well, you can come work for me. And now we've been together 6 years, and we moved to Charlotte, which is where you got to live if you want to be a NASCAR. And I help him manage sponsors, and I basically manage his career. So I got to thank Rowdy at the pizza shop for introducing me into this stuff. But Travis has really taken me to where it is now.
Wow. Thank
and
you,
sorry, Rowdy,
Rowdy,
but come on. Yeah, he would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
Wow. That one of my things I would love to ask people who are sports fan is like, what is their aha moment? Like, oh, this is a sport. I get it now. I get why people follow sports or watch sports. Everybody has a different experience or story. But what you just shared right there, Jess, never heard anything like it. I feel like I now have more understanding about just the racing culture. But just taking a step back, listeners, Jess is in the NASCAR world. She's in the American racing world. If you were to kind of give our listeners like another cliff notes, like what is racing in America? What is, because people might know Indy 500 or Daytona 500 that's happening, this week. Can you kind of share a little bit more about what is racing in the U.S.?
So racing, I will say there are 3 main like big series that Americans follow. One being NASCAR, which it only races, it's just an American, we only race in the US. And those are, each of these series have their own stereotypes, NASCAR being rednecks. And I would say that's accurate. Then you got Formula One, which everyone's really hot on right now because of the Netflix series that came out during COVID. I don't know if you guys watched it, but those are like the pretty boys. They're very fashionable. They race in, you know, bougier cities. Their circuit, like everything about it's a little more like bougie, really. And then you got IndyCar, which us NASCAR people, they think we're hillbillies, and then we call them wine and cheese racers. Like they're very like bougie, but not like, but in a different way. And so each of these, you know, a lot of race fans are race fans, but each of these series, like, I think attracts a different type of crowd. And they really are totally different aside from the fact that they're all racing automobiles. But I would say those are the three main series that Americans follow. And what makes it a little different than maybe stick and ball sports like football, basketball, is that you're not rooting for a team, you're rooting for a person, you're rooting for a driver. And that creates kind of a totally different dynamic in the fandoms. The fans can get kind of crazy because it's not a franchise. It's not, you know, the Browns. It's your guy. It's Kyle Busch or whoever it is.
Yeah, there's nobody else to like pass blame off when like something happens. Like it's not a team sport. So it's like, no, like that person messes up or that person doesn't do good in a race. Like that's just them, you know?
That's right. And there are teams in NASCAR, but people don't really see it that way. People truly just, and they identify with their person. And then on that note, they will defend their person to the death. And so there's a lot of like rivalries and it's just different. Yeah.
So, Jess, knowing that you got introduced to racing in the country in Ohio, now that you're in the big leagues, you have seen maybe different type of races. I'm not sure, have you seen all three of the properties? What's like a story or experience that drew you even deeper into the sports and racing culture?
I think so. It always goes back to that first day I went to the racetrack. I loved it because it was just basically gathering of really passionate people. I don't know. I haven't been to any Formula One shops and or any IndyCar shops, but I'm very in the NASCAR industry. It's no different at the top here in the Cup Series in NASCAR. At the end of the day, these people are the same people as back at the local tracks in terms of like their just love for the sport. I think just every time I go to a race, I am just like, these are racers at the end of the day. They're just people that love wrenching on cars and making them go fast, and just seeing how tied NASCAR is to the roots of where they came from. I don't know if you guys know this, but NASCAR actually started from moonshining, where people, you know, there are guys that would make the moonshine, but then you would have the moonshine runners that had to distribute the moonshine, and they had to make their cars fast so they could run from the cops. And you know how humans are, they're like, oh, we should make this a competition. And that eventually got so big that that people were like, we got to make this a sanctioning body, and that's how NASCAR was born.
You just got a lot more people interested into NASCAR.
Wow.
It's crazy.
That is a crazy story.
Isn't it? And then interesting enough, you know, the NFL is such a huge thing. The family that founded NASCAR 75 years ago is the same family that runs it today. Wow. It's the third generation. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, fun fact.
There's so many fun facts. Jess, something I was looking into before the recording, I mean, just that conversation today, is when I look at the fan base for racing, they're very loyal. Like you said, they cheer for a person versus a team, like you said. But I noticed that most of the fan base is growing older, and that's just what it seems like. I'm curious from your perspective, when it comes to tapping into Gen Z, we see these different proper, like for example, NBA, they're creating the in-season tournaments, they're creating virtual interaction. Formula One, they're going to Netflix, creating a show. How is racing in the US tapping into the younger generation, right? Gen Z or even younger?
Yeah. So obviously Formula One did what they needed to do there, which was that Netflix show.
Mhm.
It showed the drivers' personalities, and now I mean, you got younger people watching now.
Yeah.
The problem with NASCAR is that the drivers still are good old boys. Their hobbies are hunting and fishing and things like that. Whereas like the Formula One guys, like they're like your typical influencers. Like they're into fashion and travel and whatever. And NASCAR drivers just aren't like that. And I think that's part of the issue. NASCAR was very mainstream back in the 90s and 2000s and even before then. And you're so right. NASCAR's been in this hard spot where their fan base is getting older, and when they try to appeal to the younger fan base, sometimes you irritate your older fan base.
Yeah.
They've implemented things like the example you gave. NASCAR's doing kind of the same thing where they've implemented the playoffs, which they've never had before. They've implemented something like it's called stage racing. And basically they cut the races into like 3 segments and kind of like restart the race, like, and into segments during one race, and like a few other competition things that, you know, maybe make it appeal to a more, I think we see it in all of sports where these series and these leagues have to appeal to a casual fan.
Yeah.
Because people just don't have the attention span that they used to, and people just aren't going to like, did I just give myself balloons?
I don't know how that happened.
Well,
but people, it's just sports fans aren't the same, and so they need to do stuff to appeal to a casual fan. And so some of that comes into like going after sponsors that are like someone has Huda Beauty as a sponsor this past season, whereas like it used to be like Tide and Miller Lite and stuff like that. So
right,
they're trying, but it's a hard thing, and I don't think they've really gotten their footing right, honestly, on that topic.
You definitely hit the nail on the head, because at the end of the day, people are still trying to figure out how to tap into Gen Z. Yeah. That's for all parties.
They're hard.
It's not just NASCAR. It's from NBA, NFL to the Olympics. They're trying to figure out creative ways to enter into Gen Z and younger attention. So, no, I appreciate you sharing that. Before we move on to the next topic, listeners, if you're not intrigued about American racing by this point, I don't know what to say.
Can't help you.
Can't help you. But Jess, if you were to give, like, if one of our listeners is like, oh, where do I go? Like from here, like I kind of want to get into racing. Where would you point them?
Yeah, I would point them, if I was getting them into just racing, motorsports in general, I think I would point them to the F1 documentary on Netflix, because I think that's a very digestible piece of content where you're not going to feel overwhelmed by like having to learn rules or anything like that. You're going to be able to identify with personalities, and it'll just be a cool entry point. Then NASCAR actually just came out with their version of the show. It, I believe, is produced by the same company. I haven't watched it yet. I would say those are like digestible entry points. The thing about, and again, I can't speak on the other 2 series, IndyCar and F1, but NASCAR races are just like a party. They're a great time. Just buy a ticket. Just buy a ticket and go. That's all you'll need. I mean, you can't just, it's indescribable, the feeling of the cars going by. And after you watch it on Netflix, just go buy a ticket.
And moonshine.
And moonshine, that's right. And I will say, you could get into it. You don't have to go all the way to NASCAR. you could get into it the same way I did and buy a ticket to your local track, and that I can at least guarantee will be good people watching.
Well, listeners, you heard it. Jess, thanks for, those are great answers. And I'm definitely going to look at if there's any track near me, because all we have is horse track over here.
Where are you? You're in Kentucky, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we do have a NASCAR track in Kentucky. It's just right over the board. It's called Kentucky Motor Speedway, International Speedway, something like that. Yeah.
No, I definitely look into it.
Now you know.
Well, if there's one thing that we need more of, it is things that make us feel involved and connected to community and all of that kind of stuff, no matter what it is. I definitely think that racing is something that I would love to go to a race at some point. We always talked about going together, but
I know
I would love to go to one just because I know that feeling that you're talking about where you feel like you're a part of something and you feel like you're in a community and connected to other people. And I think that that's something really important. And speaking of, I think for our next topic, talking about feeling connected to community and talking about specifically like men's mental health. What are your guys' thoughts as we transition here on the topic of men's mental health? It's been popping up a lot lately in conversation with lots of different people from different political spectrums and ideologies and that kind of stuff. So I want to open it up to the group. What are your guys' thoughts on sort of the state of men's mental health right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you totally hit the nail on the head when you said, one of the key elements of being a human and living the human experience is community.
Yeah.
And we are just so clearly right now in this loneliness epidemic. And that applies to everyone, but even more particularly towards men. And especially middle-aged men are lonelier than ever. And I mean, we'll talk about some stats and stuff, but that's really the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. The first thing comes to mind is, who do we listen to in terms of like male voices? Like, who is people looking up to? What behavior do they have, or habits? I think that's just something, when people say men's mental health, that's the first thing I think of, because I think a lot of times the people, the men or boys looking up to might not be the best human being, period, and not the best example for holding high characteristic when it comes to being a good human being, like how they treat their partner or their kids, how they treat someone they disagree with. These are things that are hard, and I think there is a lack of good example for people to look up to these days. So that's my immediate thought when they're like, oh, that's the first thing I think of. And agreeing everything Ben just shared about community and loneliness.
Yeah.
I think that this is obviously one of those conversations that I'm probably better off to just listen rather than speak, but I do work in a very male dominated space, and spend a lot of time around men. And I think something I notice, and I'm down south, very blue collar, traditional. Something I notice is that, like you said, Caleb, community, it seems like a lot of, especially older men, don't even realize that they can talk about hard things or what they're feeling. They don't even have someone to talk to. And in fact, sometimes I feel like if they did confide in a friend, that friend is not going to be equipped to be able to have a meaningful conversation. And so I often think about how do we change that in the next generation to, I hate the term normalize at this point, but normalize, like, I feel safe and fine to have these conversations with my friends as a woman.
Yeah.
Why is it not the same? How can we make transition to where men feel the same way?
Yeah, I mean, It's interesting you bring that up. I mean, I have some stats that we have primarily gotten from the New York Times and the Pew Research Center. One of those being that roughly 15% of men say that they have no close friends at all. Not like very few friends. I'm talking zero close friends. And back in 1990, that same stat was taken, and that was only 3% of men. And so that stat is up 500% since 1990.
Yeah.
And that to me is just shocking.
Yeah. I personally don't think that you can have a conversation about men's mental health without talking about how, and I went into this conversation saying that I wasn't going to use this word, but I don't have another word to describe it. So I hope that our listeners don't immediately tune me out if this is a word that you're not comfortable with. But I don't think we can talk about men's mental health without talking about how a patriarchal society, or the patriarchy, which is upheld by men, harms men just as much as it harms women. And
Yes.
so what I would really like to just like open the dialogue up is, the world has changed rapidly over the last 100 years, and we've seen the greatest advances in technology in our knowledgeable human history, right? That does not mean that our ability to communicate and to cohabitate and to live within community has also progressed at the exact same rate. And I think based off of the numbers that we've shared here, I think they've actually regressed significantly
Mm.
with over time. And I think the a lot of people like to point fingers and say, well, it's because we're creating weak men. And it's like, I don't think that's the case. I think that we have sent narratives to young men specifically about what it means to quote unquote be a man. And this is just for anybody that's listening. Anytime you hear the phrases be a man, anything after that is just about complete BS, right? And so we've sent all of these harmful narratives about what it means to be a man. The problem is that these narratives used to have some sort of use to them, right? They
Mm.
used to. If you think 100 years ago, we're talking in the 1920s, even a little bit previously than that, you have to think a lot of people we're still suffering with even like food insecurity. So
Right.
when you don't have even your basic needs met, you're absolutely right. Be a man. This is not a time to cry. We're trying to eat here, right? The problem is that these narratives of be a man are not set up for a 21st century society where all of our needs, I don't want to say all of our needs. There are a lot of people who still do not have their basic needs met, right? But at least we know that, at least in our country, in America, there is an abundance of resources that we experience here. So how have men shifted from a world where their primary use was providing the essentials to life, to now that it's so much easier to get those essentials, all of the narratives that were useful back then are still present now?
Right.
I think that that's where we're seeing the most amount of harm that happens to men. It is through men upholding these ideas of what it means to be a man.
Right. And I think one of the issues is that, like as you mentioned, the narrative hasn't shifted and society has so much. And so as you bring up like previous gender roles that may not be so prevalent in society anymore, um, with that lack of narrative shift within men, it's created this distrust between men and women, and we're seeing higher rates of singleness than ever before, and I think that also is part of the problem. um, Men and women and just people in general have so much distrust and aren't even willing to connect anymore, and that affects the relationships that we see,
Yeah.
both romantic and non-romantic, and that becomes a generational issue that we're now really starting to see the repercussions of.
I think another point I want to add on here is kid, when you said like be a man, when there are opportunities for people to define men differently than outside of the patriarchal definition, the first thing is killing the messenger. Essentially, whatever comes out like, oh, this is different than how you define a man, shut it down. And
Yeah.
we've seen that too many times, especially when it comes to speaking, like people who have hurt others.
Yeah.
And when that's what people are afraid to speak up sometimes, right? And calling out the dysfunctional behind, I don't know, just the whole system. So I think that's another thing that's been hard is to calling out like how this is incorrect and redefining what it means to be a man. Often when it's brought up, is shut down.
Yeah.
And that's the part where I feel like now with platforms like social media, there are spaces where we can talk about it, like here, one conversation at a time. Now, I don't have the answer to everything, but I know like this is one of those ways we can hold each other to account, hold each other accountable for our words and our action. Um,
Yeah, I think in general, and there's some more stats here that like we can talk through, but I think the biggest thing that men have to do, and I think back to something that Brene Brown talked about, how when she talks about vulnerability, right? Brene Brown is sort of like a vulnerability expert. She's done a lot of extensive research out of the University of Texas, I believe. And she talks about how when she introduces herself, she goes, I'm a shame researcher, and I talk about vulnerability and courage. And she said men often look at her and say, "Oh, gotcha. So two opposite ends of the spectrum." And she's like,
Mhm.
now, okay, so like now I know who the problem is here, right? But I think it's interesting because what I've learned in my life is that the biggest thing that men are afraid of is any sense of emotional vulnerability, any type of putting themselves out there. It's the exact reason why if a guy walks up to somebody that they're interested in and they get turned down, they immediately turn around and tell their friends like F that person. They weren't actually very good looking anyways. They had like, because you're trying to soften the blow of you being vulnerable and getting rejected, right? And so my encouragement to all men, like regardless of your sexuality, regardless of any of that kind of stuff, would be you have to be very intentional with creating spaces within your own life where you're able to be vulnerable with people. And that vulnerability is true strength. Vulnerability is true
Mhm.
strength.
It
Yeah.
is, and when you deny yourself of that, I think you're denying yourself of one of the best parts
Yeah.
of the human experience.
Yeah, you rob yourself of such a connection. Like you guys even mentioned, part of the origin of your friendship was, you know, dealing with some difficult situations,
Yeah.
and the bond that's created through misery can be so deep, you know. And one of the stats that popped up that you just reminded me of, Caleb, was that only 40% of men report having ever spoken about their mental health with anyone.
Wow.
That's nuts. And then within that group, 40% of those say that they just choose to deal with it themselves. 36% say that they don't want to be a burden to others. And 29% report being too embarrassed to do so. So those are just some of the reasons that we convince ourselves not to be vulnerable with our friends.
Yeah.
Wow.
I just think in general, like there's a really great book by, I believe it's Bell Hooks, called The Will to Change, and This is sort of what sort of started me on this, like, oh crap, because I think I was on like chapter 3, and she was calling out some specific things that of how men interact with women, and I'm thinking to myself, like, oh, like, I'm progressive, like, I'm a gay man, I respect women, like, I'm a feminist, and I'm listening to this book on audio tape, and I'm thinking, oh, I, I weaponize patriarchy in my own life against people that I know. Like, and even though it's been this unconscious thing, I think there's a lot of room for us to grow together in a conversation where we start off with the fact that vulnerability is strength. It is. And you cheat. I could not agree with you more, Justin Ben. You cheat yourself out of the human experience when you don't give people that opportunity to show up for you. When you don't have, and I think another thing that goes along with men's mental health is having a narrative within yourself, having a good reputation within yourself. Are you doing the things that you say you're going to do? Are you striving to be the best version of yourself? Are you taking ownership and responsibility? If you ever talk to somebody who is successful, there are a couple of things that almost everybody has in common. There comes a point in their life where they realize that nobody's coming to save them, and that if they're going to be anything or have anything in life, if they're going to experience life in the fullness of its breadth and the heights and depths of life, that they're going to have to take responsibility over every single portion of their life, even the things that happened to them that weren't their fault, even the things that they did when they didn't know how to do better. You have to take responsibility for all of it. I could tell you where I was standing. I could tell you what I was wearing when the moment hit me. Oh crap, nobody's coming to save me. And I think everybody needs that moment, and everybody needs to be very intentional when it comes to the voices that we're listening to, who we're going to, like, just in general. Ben Shapiro is not a good person to listen to. On what's funny to me about a Ben Shapiro-esque character is that he talks about like soy boys and yuppies and all of that kind of stuff all the time, and he's literally like in essence the exact definition of what he's making fun of. And you can sort of see this extreme insecurity, and especially around how he talks about gender and that kind of stuff. And so my advice to anybody would be, start with vulnerability and understand and lock in on the fact that vulnerability is strength. From there, anytime you hear somebody say be a man, anything after that is usually just BS. And ultimately, don't, if you're trying to be better, if you're trying to work on your mental health, you hear people say this all the time. This is all over Instagram. Disappear for 6 months and then show back up and show. Bad idea. Don't disappear. We do not learn and grow in isolation. It's very rare that actually works for people. When I'm having a bad day, when I've needed to get things done in my life, I call up my friends. I literally called Jack today and talked about where I was at with my mental health, and unloaded, some things, and he was there and he listened. And I think it takes us being willing to do that. It takes us being willing to be honest and vulnerable. And yeah, I think it's something that it's a really important topic that I don't think is talked about enough, especially as it relates to even to topics like even to topics like, like women's health and that kind of stuff. It's like, if we're gonna talk about how we move the women's movement forward and feminism, we have to address the way in which men interact within themselves, and also the way in which men are interacting with their environment and the rest of the world.
So true.
Yeah. One of the things that I just thought about, Caleb, as you mentioned, like talking with Jack about mental health, is that you need to be willing to do that even when there may not necessarily be some big event, some horrible thing that happened that forces you to do that. And I can say, like, for myself personally, it wasn't until college when I had like some pretty tough life circumstances come at me all at once, where I kind of realized, like, all right, I can't do this on my own. And I remember like literally like hyping myself up almost, or convincing myself like, okay, you can do this, you can do this, and going and telling some of my friends like, guys, I'm going through it right now.
Yeah.
And I feel like in that moment when I was sharing some of my thoughts, sharing some of my feelings, then I was realizing like, why haven't I done this before? Why did I have to wait for this thing to happen to me where I'm now like down in the dumps to be able to do this, you know? And you know, if you have friends, they're willing to hear you out.
Yeah.
They're willing to try to help you. That's just part of human nature. And so that's one thing that I would try to encourage people with is don't wait until there's some horrible event that happens, or just until you are at the end of your rope. There's never an extreme that it has to get to before you have to decide to have vulnerability. And in fact, it becomes easier with time, and it's easier to share those things while they're still small, rather than letting them snowball into something that at that point you are scared of sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one thing I want to say is just, listeners, the next time if you're in a situation where somebody says be a man, or you have that internal dialogue, ask yourself where is this coming from?
Yeah.
And what is the point of this narrative? And I think at the end of the day, it's about power and control. But when we are choose to be vulnerable, we are letting go of those things over us, and we're experiencing the human experience. And when you think about when you're going through your social media, take a look at the men you're following. Would you want your significant other to be with them? Like, do you trust them? Are they, because we talked about character last week, values, integrity, honesty, patience, self-control. Like, these are things that are so hard, but sometimes are not upheld when it comes to influencers or people we follow. We see making a lot of money, having a six pack, having a lot of women. Like, are those things truly going to fill the hole in your heart?
Yeah.
And I think that's a question when the moment you feel like you need more, like, just take a step back and ask yourself, like, where is this coming from? And how do I unlearn this thought process?
Yeah.
And Ben, Caleb, like, I know myself, like, when we have that moment, like, oh, like, I can't do this by myself, but I want to be better. Like, those are moments that we start to grow, and it doesn't get easier. It gets harder. It's still hard, but we know, like, I know how I felt just even after, like, sharing something vulnerable with my wife or my friend, my guy friends, so yeah, definitely just take a pause and just, like, asking yourself, like, where is this inner dialogue coming from, and why is it there?
Yeah.
You mentioned social media. For me, TikTok has been great in helping me realize that I grew up with a lot of internalized misogyny, and I admittedly don't spend a lot of time with kids right now at this point in my life, but I hope that these kids that are growing up, with the internet access way earlier than any of us did. My hope is that, of course, it could go one way where they could be, like you said, have all these role models that aren't really great role models. Alternatively, I hope that they're actually being fed content like I experienced that opened my mind more. I'm not spending enough time around kids these days to know where that's going, but that would be my hope, is that it actually ends up being a positive thing, because you know, a lot of people grow up in an echo chamber and they might not even be introduced to a lot of these things we're talking about otherwise.
Yeah, totally. So, listeners, your big takeaways from that: spend some time in self reflection. Like Jack said, think about where your thoughts are coming from, where your influences are, but then also don't just do that self reflection and keep it to yourself. Go spend time with people and go share those thoughts, share that thinking. More likely than not, they will also do the same back to you because you've now opened up a door for them. And
True.
one tip that I will give you that will make that just a little bit easier is have it around some kind of an event. Don't just barge into someone's room and say, hey man, this is what's on my mind right now, because that might be a really tough thing to step into. So, one of the ways that I've done this in the past is um, going out to uh, going out to watch a basketball game together, or maybe going out to dinner and allowing conversation to head in that direction naturally, because that's one of the things that we're also lacking in this generation is just conversation.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to talk about something that's difficult when you're already in conversation. Um, One of the ways I like to hang out with friends is going to a movie, talking about the movie. Let's hear about the themes and that kind of thing. Um, so Jack, what's kind of the
Yeah.
last movie that you saw?
Well, this is a great movie, listeners, to talk about, to maybe even help jumpstart that conversation. uh, Recently, a movie dropped called Madam Web. It's made by Sony Pictures. Ben, I actually haven't seen it, but I have been following just what fans' reaction to it. So,
Mhm.
listeners, if you don't know, Sony owns the property to Spider-Man, and within the last 3 to 5 years, we have seen great Spider-Man movies. We have seen Somewhere in the Middle, but we also seen movies like Morbius, and I'm not going to debate on that. Um,
Morbius.
but so
Hey,
Sony had,
Sony did good with the first Spider-Man movies, and then
yeah,
Marvel's been doing good with the
yeah,
Spider-Man movies.
yeah. So
Uh,
they also did okay with Venom as well. But listeners, they just dropped a new film called Madam Web. It follows the story of this woman realizing she is able to see things happen before it does. So that's just kind of the movie. And obviously, there is a villain, and she meets other uh, women who are experiencing something similar in terms of something in their life is changing. Anyways, I'll cut the my thoughts short. The reaction has been poor in terms of like the movies and flop, and it's just funny that Sony, they have Spider-Man, but it feels like they don't know how to tell a good story. This is nothing a reflection of the actresses. I also haven't seen the movie. I can't say anything, but Morbius and now Madam Web, I just feel like something's happening here. Like what's missing?
So for Madam Web specifically, I think a couple of things are really really funny about it. Number one, there are like two shots where the boom mic is literally in frame.
oh, come on.
Miss Kersey would not have had any of that.
Let me tell you something. If Lori Kersey saw a boom mic in the frame, that would not have went to final production. So the fact that you are two of the greatest studios in the entire world, and you're like, I thought that was very sloppy. It didn't do very well in the box office. I think it has like a 20% on Rotten Tomatoes or something like that. And let me just say this: I genuinely think we have moved past the era of like superhero movies. Give it, back burner it. I'm not saying that it's over to the fandom that loves Marvel. Keep loving Marvel. I'm not here to yuck anybody's yum. I'm just saying too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing, and we see movies like this being made.
Guess
Okay.
what though? If there's any movie that comes out that has anything to do with Spider-Man, I'm watching it. So I'm still, even though I know this movie's gonna be terrible, I'm still so excited, and I have it
Yes.
on my calendar to go watch Madam Web.
Shut up. You do?
I'm not even
That's
joking. I'm
crazy.
so excited because, you know, people can hate on it all they want, but until I've seen it, I
Yeah.
can still hold on to that hope, that optimism.
Yeah.
The diagram, there's a Venn diagram of race fans and superhero movie fans and them just being like absolutely crazy. It's a circle, okay? Y'all are cut from the same cloth. That's my thought on it.
Honestly, I'm not
funny.
even like a huge superhero fan, but it's just Spider-Man. That specifically.
I can relate to that, and I do need to watch the movie before I truly share my pieces of feedback. But if the boom mic is in there, I feel like that tells me half of the things I need to know about this film.
Yeah, I'm gonna be looking out for that.
You guys want to hear something honestly pathetic?
Yes.
Thank you, Jess.
Yes.
I'm actually have not watched any Marvel or any superhero movies since like 2015.
Shut up.
I never have.
In hopes that one day, but this is very strategic, Jess. In hopes that one day I will have a boyfriend who will be like super into it, and I want to gift him the pleasure of being able to explain it all to me and like go through and like literally see my live reaction, because there are so many films and so many movies that I genuinely I'm lost with it, and I just don't really care that much. But
no, that is literally the sweetest thing I have ever heard.
Very
Okay.
selfless.
But yes, but I do want to tell you, not to burst your bubble, but Travis had never seen any of the Harry Potter films, and I sat him down and we like got through like the whole series in like a week. And so I'm of course sitting there like, you know, next to him, like when something happens, and like it was very disappointing. So
listen, I watched Harry Potter for the first time as an adult too, because obviously that was growing up.
Yeah, you were not allowed to do that.
I remember, I think the first time that I went over to your house, I think my parents asked if we were going to be watching Harry Potter or not. I'm being so serious.
There was a period of time where I felt like your parents might have thought my parents were not good parents, or they just weren't really sure, which my parents did the same thing to people they didn't know. They would call and, you know, but yeah. So sorry,
I haven't seen any of the Harry Potters.
No
and,
way.
My wife is a big Harry Potter fan, but shout out to Abigail, because that's my wife, because she knows me well enough to know that making me watch those movies is a horrible idea. Like, she's gonna just enjoy it in her own corner, because she knows that if I watch it and I start roasting the Harry Potter movies, if on the off chance that I don't like it, then it's game over, you know?
Yeah.
Ben, you gotta give it a chance, seriously. And Caleb, while that's so selfless of you, I wish you experienced watching Marvel movies in a theater.
I know,
such as the Infinity War, or there's certain movies, but no, that's very thoughtful. I didn't even think about it that way. And I'm sorry, Jess, like when you show the Harry Potter, like I love showing my wife like something I love and just wait for their reaction. And when they don't give me that reaction, I'm like, I don't know what this means.
Well, I give it right back to him when we watched the whole Fast and Furious franchise. So we're even.
Well, cool, y'all. Well, Jessica, first of all, thank you so much for being here on the podcast today. It's been such a joy having you and getting caught up and talking about all of this stuff. So thank you so much for being here. Folks, we will be back next week. Remember, episodes release Friday at 8 a.m. Follow us on social media at Generation Varied on all of the socials. And yeah, we've got some exciting things that are happening that we plan on talking about in the coming weeks. So yeah, thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week.